This is easily the best budget wide-angle zoom for Nikon Z photographers, and today I'll be giving you my full review on it for landscape photography. So let's jump right in and get right to it. What's up, y'all? It's Project Photography back with another video, and today, before we get started, make sure to follow all of my socials down in the description bar below. And this right here is the Nikon Z 12-28mm f3.5-5.6 power zoom VR. And I am honestly blown away by how great this lens has performed over these past couple months. And I'm ready to make my full review on this lens for landscape photography. There's gonna be a lot that we're gonna be talking about in this video, but we're gonna start it off with ergonomics, go to image quality, then go to who should pick up this lens, and then right into the conclusion. So without further ado, let's jump right in and talk about the ergonomics. And you cannot talk about this lens without talking about the power zoom. Initially, I was not a big fan of the power zoom, and a big reason is I could not see what focal length I was shooting at. And this would cause some issues for me because sometimes I just wouldn't know what focal length I was shooting at. And for me, I want to know exactly where I'm shooting because it could definitely change how I shoot or what type of scenario I'm going to be in. And this was all cleaned up with firmware 1.1 on the Nikon Z30. I was able to see what focal length I'm shooting at, and actually thanks to a few of you guys in the comments for pointing it out. This wasn't something that I was aware of at the time. This is clearly much better than what we had before, and now I'm able to see the exact focal length I'm shooting at on my screen. The only issue is I cannot see it when I'm using the horizon leveler. And to me, that does kind of suck because I like using the horizon leveler, especially when I'm on a tripod, trying to get that perfect composition. But I switch back between that and then the regular focal length pretty often. So it isn't a huge deal. It is definitely better than not having it at all. And that is one major gripe that I previously had with this 12-28 that has now been fixed. It is an internal zoom, which for me, I really enjoy, especially for landscape photography, because when we're out in the elements, we don't have to worry about dust or water getting into the lens, which I found could be an issue, especially in very rough conditions. So it's funny because initially I thought the power zooming would be a negative for me for landscape photography, and now I'm almost seeing it as a plus because that internal zoom and because we can see the focal length on the back of the screen. Now that is a major gripe that I have found that is fixed. Of course, I would still obviously prefer to have the different focal lengths on the lens itself, but you know, we got to do what we got to do, and I don't really feel like it inhibits me from capturing the landscapes that I want to capture. One thing I am glad about is the fact that there is a manual focusing ring here, and that isn't necessarily something that is always found on lenses of this price point, so I'm glad that they definitely included it. It has a nice little thread here, very easy to turn, very smooth, and I found it very efficient when manual focusing for landscape photography. So this lens is a plastic build, and that may be a good thing for some, may not be a good thing for others. But for me, I actually think it is quite a positive when using it with the Z30 in particular. And this will probably apply to majority of the other APS-C size bodies, but I found that it actually balances really well with the Z30. And that's not always the case with the Z30, because I found that with other lenses, full frame lenses in particular, it can be very lens heavy because the Z30 is such a lightweight body. But the plastic build on here, along with its compactness, makes it very nice to handhold with the Z30, and especially on a tripod. But of course, the weight is a major component of why it balances so well, and a big part of it is that plastic build. It comes in at 205 grams, which is insanely light, by the way, compared to something like the Nikon Z 14-30mm f4S. That lens is around 479 grams, so that makes it 12-28 57% lighter than the 14-30. And the 14-30 was already a really light lens, and I just feel like this is so much easier to carry around, especially if you don't have a big bag, or if you're even hiking to really far away locations. This will, you know, take a lot of that strain off of you. On top of it, this lens is absolutely tiny. It's such a compact lens, and this can fit in so many more places that something like a 14-30 would not be able to fit into, especially in my Shimoda Action X30. I love carrying this around, and you just forget that it's even there. It allows for you to have more gear in your backpack to substitute it with other sorts of lenses. You could even bring an additional one because this lens is just so small. Of course, even though it does have a plastic build, it does have very good weather sealing, apparently. I didn't really know that until I actually had to look it up, because I'm not sure sometimes if lenses like this have weather sealing. This one definitely does, and it definitely makes sense because I took this out to the beach yesterday, and my gosh, it was incredibly windy. It was crazy, And you know, this lens survived all of it, so I have no complaints when it comes to longevity or the weather sealing at all. Overall, ergonomics wise, I really enjoy the build of it. Initially I thought the power zoom would be an issue, but I really don't find that to be a problem. On top of it, it's being small, compact, and very lightweight just makes it such a great lens to balance with the Nikon Z30 in particular. So now let's move on to image quality. And this is an area that really surprised me. I was not expecting this to perform as well as it does. And I think the main area that performs best in is sharpness. This lens is insanely sharp for honestly no reason. I mean, it's a $350 lens and you don't expect this level of sharpness with it. I mean, if we look in the center, it's very sharp. I mean, there's really nothing to say about it. We get incredible amounts of detail, so much detail that I think it exceeds a Z30 sensor. And if Nikon ended up coming out with something like a 36 megapixel APS-C size sensor, this lens would absolutely be able to handle it. I have no issues with that at all. But as we go into the corners, I have found it is also very sharp. And one thing to kind of note is that the focal length on here is a 12-28, so that's about a full frame equivalent to an 18-42, and it's not super wide, but it is a nice focal length. And I just found that even though it's at 18 millimeters, we're still able to get that insane corner sharpness, and we don't get smearing at all, which I'm actually really surprised about. I mean, again, like, this is a $350 lens. You don't expect it to perform the way it does, but it absolutely did. It just picks up so much detail that you really just don't know what to do with it, especially with a Z30. But to me, I mean, that's the best part about this lens in terms of image quality. But let's talk about vignetting, because it is a little bit of a different story. What I have personally found is that there is a decent amount of vignetting wide open. And now this applies from the focal range of wide all the way to the telephoto. I mean, I think that's just one trade-off about this lens. But again, like, you can always stop it down to f8, and those corners and the vignetting clean up very nicely. So there really isn't an issue with that at all, especially if you're gonna be using this for landscape photography, you are using it on a tripod, are able to get the exact exposure that you want, and most of the time you should be shooting at f8 anyways. One really random note about this lens is I feel like the filters that I was using didn't really affect it that much when it came to vignetting. I think a big part of it has to do with the focal length itself. 18 millimeters isn't incredibly wide. We're not talking about like a 14 millimeter. I'm talking about full frame equivalent, by the way. And so I just feel like it's not really going to be that big of an issue throwing that 10 stop, that 6 stop on there. I think it'll perform really well. And I'm not sure, you guys will have to correct me on this. I'm not 100% sure, but I think another part of it could be is that my filters are 82 millimeters and this is a 67 millimeter filter thread. So maybe that has a part of it when it comes to vignetting performance. I did mention the focal length a lot in this part, but I really want to dive in and talk about it in particular, because to me, this is a strong suit of this lens. Now, the focal range in particular is, in terms of full frame, it's about an 18 to 42 millimeters. Now, that is quite a wide focal range. And now the 14 to 30 and the 17 to 28 are much more narrow when it comes to the focal range relative to this lens. We're getting an extra about 10 to 12 millimeters on this lens relative to those lenses. And honestly, I found that it's really good for landscape photography. I actually found myself shooting at 28 millimeters in terms of the APS-C quite a bit. I mean, we're able to get those really tack sharp images even so. I also feel like the images clean up even more at those longer focal ranges. So I really like it a lot, but I do feel like 18 millimeters is not as wide as you want it to be. We do get a lot less distortion. I have found it is more difficult to showcase those foreground elements, and that's just a part of it. It's not necessarily this lens's fault, but it's something you have to keep in mind when picking up a lens like this. How much are you really going to be using foreground elements? Do you really want to exaggerate it all that much? It's really up to you and what you prefer in your landscape photography. But if we're talking about the efficacy and how this lens performs in terms of wideness, it will capture like 95% of landscapes, all of it that you want in the frame. So you really shouldn't be worrying about, oh, is this lens wide enough? It is wide enough, but is it my preference for how I shoot? Most likely not, but I think for like 95% of photographers out there, you will be just fine with this in terms of its wideness. An area where I feel like the lens could improve on is color rendition. It's not amazing. It's fine. It'll get the job done. I do feel like those blues are a little more on the teal side, which to me is an indicator of not as good image quality, but I'm gonna be honest with you, it's something you can definitely clean up in post. Not a huge deal. Definitely something to note though, where this this lens would separate itself from something like a 14-30. Another area it can improve on is the micro contrast. I just feel like the images don't pop out as much. They're a little bit flatter. But again, those two things probably are because of the APS-C size sensor in the Z30. It's just not as good image quality wise versus something like a full frame camera. And for me, it is absolutely noticeable. But again, like if you're going to be picking up a Z30 as your main camera, I really don't know if you'll notice that much of a difference. I'm incredibly picky when it comes to my image quality and the cameras I use, so that might not even be something that you really have to worry about. But overall, when it comes to image quality, the 12-28 is incredibly good for the price it's at. We have to remember this is not a $1,300 lens like the 14-30 is. I mean, that's roughly a 4 times more expensive lens versus this. And is that going to give you 4 times better image quality? That's a question that you have to ask for yourself. But if you're picking up this lens, it's because you're on a budget, you're someone that wants to save a little bit of money, and I'm gonna be honest with you, I think you're gonna really enjoy the images that come out of this lens. Now, a big question you guys are probably thinking is, okay, it sounds like an amazing lens, but who should buy this lens? And to me, there's 2 groups of photographers that I think would really make sense for a lens like this. The first one is that if you have a Z30, you have a ZFC, or you have a Z50, and you want a wide angle zoom as your main wide angle setup for your landscape photography, this is it. I mean, this is an incredible lens for the dollar. $350 is an absolute steal for the amount of sharpness, the amount of level of image quality you get, and just the way that it handles with the Z30 in particular. I think this is a no-brainer if the Z30 or an APS-C size camera is your main camera. But here's the thing, if you have a full frame camera and an APS-C size camera, it does not make sense to pick up this lens as your main wide angle. And let me explain why. First of all, the 14-30 is a superior lens to this overall. It has better image quality, better build quality, and on top of it, if you're putting it on a full frame body, it's going to produce far better images. And your wide angle is going to be the camera that you use majority of the time. I use it roughly 85 to like 90% of the time. The telephoto is where I'm using it probably 10% of the time. So if you're really gonna be using the wide angle majority of the time, and you have that full frame, it just makes so much more sense to use a full frame wide angle lens and then use a telephoto with something like your APS-C size body. And it mainly has to do with the APS-C size sensor's image quality, not really this lens, because I'm actually very impressed image quality wise with the 12-28. It just has to do with the APS-C size sensor. But the second group of people that really should consider this lens for their main wide angle is if you aren't in the Nikon Z system already and you're looking for that amazing budget option to produce insane image quality across the board. I really strongly believe that a Z30 plus a 12-28 and something like a 50-250 would just make an incredible kit. We're talking about a sub $1,000 kit versus like if you got a 14-30, that by itself is like $1,300 new. And I mean, I'm gonna be honest with you, I don't know if you can really tell the difference all that much if you're not pixel peeping. So if you're in one of those 2 camps, it makes a lot of sense to pick up this lens as the main wide angle. But other than that, it might make more sense to just go with a full frame and then the 14-30 in particular. But of course, that's just my opinion. If you feel like, you know, this does make sense for you, then go for it. I would really encourage it. It's an incredible lens and you're gonna be really happy with the images that come out of it. So yeah, guys, with that being said, let's jump right into the conclusion. And honestly, I am really impressed by the 12-28. The image quality is superb. I'm really surprised by how well it performed in terms of its sharpness in particular. Its lightweight, compact form factor makes it such an incredible combination with something like a Z30. It's something that you just throw in your bag and completely forget that it's there in the first place. This is a lens that I think a lot of budget photographers in particular can really take advantage of. And if you use an APS-C size, sensor as your main camera, this could be it for landscape photography as your wide angle. We don't have any other option, and honestly, I don't think they need another option. This is it if you wanted that wide angle to blow you away for under $400. And of course, you could spend 4 times more money on a 14-30, but is that really gonna get you 4 times better image quality? That's a question that you have to answer yourself for you and for your own kit. For me personally though, this will not be my main wide angle. I do have my entire Nikon Z kit, and my 14-30 is the best wide angle I've ever used. So for me, it just makes sense to use that over the 12-28. But in a pinch, I would not mind bringing this around as more of a walk around lightweight setup. So yeah, guys, let me know what you guys think of the 12-28 f3.5 to 5.6 Power Zoom VR is an incredible lens, and honestly, if you picked it up, I think you'd be really happy with it. Let me know what you think about it down in the comment section down below. Thank you so much for experiencing the world with me today. Please feel free to rate, comment, subscribe, and I'll catch you guys in the next one.